Imagine you are at the greatest party in the most powerful kingdom on earth. Music echoes through a massive palace. Gold cups shine under torchlight. Hundreds of nobles laugh, drink, and celebrate as the night grows louder and wilder. This was not an ordinary feast. This was the royal banquet of King Belshazzar of Babylon. 1,000 of the most powerful people in the empire had gathered inside the palace. Wine flowed endlessly. The tables were filled with riches, and the king himself sat proudly at the center of it all. But that night, the king made a decision that would change history forever. In the middle of the celebration, Belshazzar gave a strange command. He ordered his servants to bring out sacred golden cups that had once belonged to the temple of God in Jerusalem. These cups were not ordinary objects. They had been taken years earlier when Babylon conquered Jerusalem. They were meant for worship. They were meant for holy use. But that night, the king used them for something else. Belshazzar and his guests began drinking wine from them. They laughed. They praised their own gods. They mocked the God of heaven. For a moment, it looked like nothing would happen. The music continued. The laughter grew louder. But suddenly, something appeared in the palace. Not a soldier. Not a messenger. Not even a ghost. A hand. A mysterious hand appeared out of nowhere. Right beside the lampstand on the palace wall, the hand began to write. Slowly, deliberately, letters formed on the stone wall in glowing light. The entire room froze. The music stopped. The king's face turned pale. His legs trembled so violently that his knees knocked together. Because no one knew who the hand belonged to. But everyone knew one thing. Whatever was written on that wall was a message no king could ignore. And before the night was over, an empire would fall. The palace of Babylon was filled with noise. Music echoed across the massive hall. Servants hurried from table to table carrying golden cups filled with wine. The torches along the walls flickered, casting warm light over the celebration. King Belshazzar sat proudly at the center of the great banquet. Around him were nobles, commanders, wealthy officials, and powerful guests from across the empire. Nearly 1,000 people had gathered for the royal feast. Babylon was one of the richest and most powerful cities in the ancient world. Its walls were enormous. Its treasures were legendary, and its rulers believed their power would last forever. The atmosphere that night was loud, confident, and careless. Wine flowed freely. Laughter grew louder with every passing hour. Then, in the middle of the celebration, Belshazzar made a bold decision. Perhaps it was pride. Perhaps it was drunken arrogance. But the king wanted to show his guests something unusual. He ordered the servants to bring sacred objects that had once belonged to the temple of God in Jerusalem. Years earlier, Babylon's armies had conquered Jerusalem and carried many treasures back to Babylon. Among those treasures were golden cups from the holy temple. These cups had been used by priests in worship. They were not ordinary drinking vessels. They were sacred, but Belshazzar treated them like trophies. When the servants returned, they carried the shining golden cups carefully into the banquet hall. The king lifted one of them high. The metal glowed in the firelight. "Fill it with wine," he commanded. The servants obeyed. Soon the sacred cups were passed around the room. The king drank. His nobles drank. His wives and concubines drank. But the celebration went even further. As they drank from the holy vessels, the king and his guests began praising their own gods. They praised gods of gold, gods of silver, gods of bronze, gods of iron, wood, and stone, statues and idols that could not see, could not hear, could not speak. The crowd cheered. Music played louder. The king smiled proudly as the celebration reached its peak. But in that very moment, everything changed. Suddenly, something appeared near the lampstand on the palace wall. At first, no one noticed. Then someone gasped. A hand had appeared in the air, not attached to a body, not connected to any person, just a hand, floating beside the wall. The music stopped. The laughter faded into silence. Every eye in the hall turned toward the wall. The mysterious hand began to move. Slowly, deliberately, its fingers pressed against the stone surface and began to write. Letters appeared one by one, glowing in the torchlight. No one spoke. No one moved. The enormous banquet hall became completely silent. King Belshazzar stared at the writing. His face instantly turned pale. The confident king who had been laughing moments earlier now looked terrified. The Bible describes the moment vividly. His thoughts frightened him. His legs became weak. His knees knocked together. The most powerful man in the room suddenly looked completely helpless. The hand finished writing. Then it disappeared, just as mysteriously as it had appeared. But the message remained. Strange words written across the palace wall. Words no one understood. Belshazzar jumped to his feet. "Bring the wise men," he shouted desperately. "Bring the astrologers. Bring the magicians." Messengers rushed from the palace to summon the greatest scholars of Babylon. Soon the king's advisors filled the hall. These men were experts in mysteries, dreams, and ancient languages. Surely they could explain the message. The king pointed toward the wall. "Whoever reads this writing and explains its meaning," Belshazzar declared, "will be clothed in purple and given a gold chain around his neck. And he will become the third highest ruler in the kingdom." It was an enormous reward. The wise men stepped forward one by one. They studied the strange letters. They whispered to each other. They examined every symbol carefully. But the longer they looked, the more confused they became. No one could read it. No one understood the message. Whispers spread through the hall. Fear grew among the guests. If the wisest men in Babylon could not understand the message, then what could it possibly mean? King Belshazzar became even more frightened. His face grew pale again. The nobles around him looked equally terrified. The entire celebration had turned into a nightmare. But then something unexpected happened. The queen mother entered the hall. She had heard the commotion from another part of the palace. When she saw the king's fear and the confusion in the room, she spoke calmly. "Your Majesty," she said, "do not be alarmed. There is a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of the holy gods." She continued speaking. "In the days of your father, King Nebuchadnezzar, this man was known for wisdom, understanding, and insight. He was able to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve difficult problems." Then she revealed the name. "His name is Daniel." The room grew quiet again. Some of the older officials remembered that name. Many years earlier, Daniel had served under the great King Nebuchadnezzar. He had explained mysterious dreams. He had revealed secrets no one else could understand. If anyone could read the message on the wall, perhaps it was him. Belshazzar immediately gave the command, "Bring Daniel at once." Messengers hurried through the palace gates. And soon, the man who could reveal the meaning of the mysterious message would stand before the king. But the explanation Daniel was about to give was not the answer Belshazzar wanted to hear, because the writing on the wall was not a blessing. It was a judgment, and before the night ended, Babylon itself would fall. The palace hall was still silent. The music had stopped. The laughter had vanished. What had begun as a night of celebration had now become a night filled with fear. The strange writing still glowed faintly on the palace wall. King Belshazzar could not stop staring at it. Those mysterious words had appeared out of nowhere, written by a hand that no one could explain. And none of the wise men of Babylon could read them. The greatest scholars in the empire stood quietly in the hall, their heads lowered in embarrassment. For the first time in many years, the king realized something terrifying. All the power of Babylon could not explain the message on that wall. Then the palace doors opened. A messenger returned. Behind him walked an elderly man. His clothes were simple, his face calm, his eyes steady. This man was Daniel. Many years had passed since Daniel had served under the great king Nebuchadnezzar. Time had moved on. Kings had changed. Empires had grown stronger. And Daniel had faded into the background of Babylon's government. But those who remembered the past knew something important about him. Daniel had once revealed secrets no one else could understand. He had explained dreams that had troubled kings. He had spoken truths others were too afraid to say. Now he stood once again before a Babylonian ruler. King Belshazzar looked at him carefully. "So you are Daniel," the king said, "one of the exiles my father brought from Judah. I have heard that the spirit of the gods is in you, and that you have insight, intelligence, and wisdom." Belshazzar pointed toward the glowing words on the wall. "The wise men could not read this writing or tell me what it means. But I have heard that you can interpret mysteries." The king then repeated his promise. "If you can read this writing and tell me what it means, you will be clothed in purple. A gold chain will be placed around your neck, and you will become the third highest ruler in the kingdom." The entire hall watched Daniel closely. Most people would have been eager for such a reward. Power, wealth, honor. But Daniel did not look impressed. He spoke calmly. "You may keep your gifts for yourself," Daniel said, "or give them to someone else. Nevertheless, I will read the writing for the king and tell him what it means. A quiet tension filled the hall. Daniel stepped forward. But before explaining the message on the wall, he did something unexpected. He began telling a story about another king. Your father, Nebuchadnezzar, Daniel said. He was one of the greatest rulers Babylon had ever known. God had given him power, glory, and authority. People from many nations feared him. But Nebuchadnezzar had once become proud. He believed his power came from himself. He believed his kingdom existed because of his own greatness. And because of that pride, God humbled him. Daniel reminded the king of a famous moment in Babylon's history. Nebuchadnezzar had lost his sanity. He had lived like a wild animal for years. He ate grass like cattle. His hair grew long. His nails became like claws. Until finally he recognized that God rules over all kingdoms. Only then was his kingdom restored. Daniel looked directly at Belshazzar. But you, his son, have not humbled yourself, even though you knew all of this. The king shifted uncomfortably. The nobles watched nervously. Daniel continued speaking. You have set yourself against the Lord of heaven. You brought the sacred cups from his temple. You and your nobles, your wives and concubines drank wine from them. You praised gods of silver and gold, bronze, iron, wood, and stone, gods that cannot see or hear or understand. Then Daniel spoke the words that revealed the heart of the problem. But you did not honor the God who holds your life in his hand. The hall was completely silent. Every guest could feel the weight of Daniel's words. Then Daniel pointed toward the wall. That is why he sent the hand that wrote the message. All eyes turned once again to the mysterious writing. Daniel stepped closer to it. The glowing letters were still clearly visible. He read them aloud. MENE, MENE, TEKEL, PARSIN. The strange words echoed through the hall. But no one understood them. Then Daniel explained. MENE means, God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. The king's face turned pale. Daniel continued. TEKEL means, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. A nervous whisper spread among the nobles. Finally, Daniel spoke the last word. PARSIN means, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. The message was clear. God had judged the king. Babylon's days were numbered, and the empire that once ruled the world was about to fall. That very night, King Belshazzar stood frozen. The meaning of the message echoed through his mind. The celebration had turned into a prophecy of destruction, and the most terrifying part was that there was nothing he could do to stop it. But outside the palace walls, events were already unfolding that would soon prove Daniel's words were true. Because before the sun rose, Babylon would no longer rule the world. The palace hall was completely silent. Daniel's words still hung in the air like a storm about to break. MENE, MENE, TEKEL, PARSIN. God had numbered the days of Babylon. The king had been weighed and found wanting. The kingdom would be divided and given to the Medes and Persians. For a long moment, no one spoke. The nobles looked at one another in disbelief. Babylon fall. It sounded impossible. Babylon was the greatest city on earth. Its walls were enormous, so wide that chariots could ride side by side on top of them. Its gates were made of bronze. Its armies were powerful. Its wealth was legendary. For generations, Babylon had ruled over nations. How could such a kingdom collapse in a single night? But even though the message terrified him, King Belshazzar did something unexpected. Perhaps he was trying to appear strong in front of his nobles. Perhaps he hoped the prophecy would somehow fail. Or perhaps he simply wanted to keep his promise. The king gave the order. Clothed Daniel in purple. Servants quickly brought royal garments. They placed a purple robe over Daniel's shoulders. A gold chain was placed around his neck. Then the king made the announcement. Daniel will be the third highest ruler in the kingdom. The nobles applauded weakly. But the celebration felt hollow, because everyone in the room had heard the message. And deep down, many of them were beginning to believe it. Outside the palace walls, the city of Babylon continued as if nothing had happened. Guards walked along the massive walls. Merchants slept in their homes. Torches burned quietly in the streets. But far beyond the city, another army was moving. For months, the armies of the Medes and Persians had surrounded Babylon. Their leader was Cyrus the Great. He had already conquered many nations. But Babylon was different. The city seemed impossible to capture. Its walls were too strong. Its defenses too great. Its supplies too plentiful. Babylon could survive a siege for years. But Cyrus had discovered something important. A weakness. The great Euphrates River flowed directly through the city. Massive walls had been built along the riverbanks to protect it. But if the water level dropped low enough, an army might be able to enter beneath the gates. So while Babylon celebrated inside its walls, Cyrus's soldiers were quietly working in the darkness. They had dug channels to redirect the river. Slowly, the water level of the Euphrates began to fall. Inside the palace, the banquet was slowly breaking apart. Many nobles had lost their appetite. The message on the wall had shaken them deeply. Some whispered nervously to each other. Others glanced toward the palace doors, as if expecting danger. But King Belshazzar tried to ignore the fear. He ordered the music to begin again. Servants poured more wine. The king raised his cup as if the prophecy meant nothing. But outside the city, the river was continuing to drop. The Euphrates flowed lower and lower. Soon the riverbed beneath the city walls became shallow enough to walk through. Cyrus gave the signal. Thousands of Persian soldiers quietly entered the riverbed. Step by step, they moved through the dark water channel beneath Babylon's mighty walls. The guards along the river gates should have been watching. But that night, many of them were distracted by the celebration inside the city. Others believed Babylon's defenses were so strong that no enemy could ever enter. By the time they realized what was happening, it was already too late. Persian soldiers were inside the city. They moved quickly through the streets. Some secured the gates. Others captured guard posts. Still others advanced toward the royal palace. Inside the banquet hall, the party had grown quieter. Many guests had already left, but the king remained. And suddenly, a distant noise echoed through the palace. Shouting, running footsteps, clashing metal. The palace doors burst open. A terrified messenger rushed inside. "Your Majesty," he shouted, "the enemy is inside the city." The room erupted into chaos. Nobles jumped to their feet. Some tried to run. Others shouted orders to guards. The music stopped instantly. Belshazzar stared at the messenger in disbelief. "What are you saying?" he demanded. "The Persians," the messenger cried. "They are already in Babylon." The prophecy had come true. Exactly as Daniel had said. Panic spread through the palace. But the invading army was already too close. Within minutes, Persian soldiers stormed the royal palace. Guards attempted to defend the king. But the attack was swift. And that night, the unthinkable happened. The mighty city of Babylon fell. King Belshazzar was killed. The empire that once ruled the world ended in a single night. And just as the mysterious message had declared, the kingdom was given to another ruler. A new king would soon take the throne. His name was Darius the Mede. Babylon's glory had vanished. But the message on the wall remained one of the most powerful warnings in history. Because the fall of Babylon was not just about a city. It was about something deeper. A reminder that power, wealth, and pride can disappear in a single night. And that no kingdom, no ruler, and no empire is greater than the judgment of God. The great city of Babylon had fallen. Only hours earlier, its palace had been filled with music, laughter, and celebration. Now the halls were silent. The torches that once lit the royal banquet flickered over empty tables and overturned cups. The mighty empire that had ruled the world for generations had collapsed in a single night. Exactly as the message on the wall had declared. The mysterious words, MENE, MENE, TEKEL, PARSIN. They were not just strange symbols written for one king. They were a warning that echoed far beyond the palace of Babylon. Because the story of King Belshazzar was not simply about politics or war. It was about something deeper. It was about pride. For generations, Babylon believed it was untouchable. Its walls were enormous. Its treasures were endless. Its armies were powerful. And its kings believed their kingdom would last forever. But the feast of Belshazzar revealed something dangerous. The king did not just celebrate. He mocked what was sacred. He took holy objects from the temple of God and used them like ordinary cups at a drunken party. He praised gods made of gold and silver, idols that could not see, could not hear, could not think. And while doing all of this, he ignored the God who had allowed Babylon to exist in the first place. Daniel had said something very important that night. You did not honor the God who holds your life in his hand. Those words reveal the heart of the story. Belshazzar believed he was in control, but he wasn't. He believed Babylon's power came from its walls, its armies, and its wealth. But it didn't. Everything he had could disappear in a moment. And that is exactly what happened. The writing on the wall was not random. Each word carried meaning. MENE. God had counted the days of the kingdom. Belshazzar believed his reign would continue indefinitely, but God had already determined its end. TEKEL. The king had been weighed. In ancient times, merchants used scales to measure precious metals. Only something pure and valuable would pass the test. But Belshazzar had been placed on the scales of justice, and he had been found lacking. PARSIN. The kingdom would be divided. The empire that once ruled the world would now belong to someone else. Within hours, the Medes and Persians entered Babylon, and the prophecy was fulfilled. The story shows something powerful. Human power may appear unstoppable, but history shows again and again that no empire lasts forever. The greatest kingdoms eventually fall. The strongest rulers eventually fade. But the message written on that wall continues to speak across thousands of years. It asks a question that every generation must face. What happens when pride replaces humility? What happens when people ignore the truth they already know? King Belshazzar was not ignorant. Daniel reminded him that he already knew the story of his predecessor, Nebuchadnezzar II. He knew how that powerful king had been humbled. He knew how pride had nearly destroyed him. But Belshazzar chose to ignore that lesson. And that decision changed everything. Sometimes the most dangerous mistake a person can make is not a lack of knowledge. It is ignoring the knowledge they already have. Belshazzar had seen the history of his own kingdom. He had seen how quickly power could disappear. But instead of learning from the past, he repeated the same arrogance. That is why the message on the wall appeared at the height of the celebration. Not when the king was afraid, not when he was weak, but when he felt most powerful. Because pride often grows strongest when success seems secure. And that is when people become blind to danger. The fall of Babylon teaches something that still applies today. Success does not guarantee security. Wealth does not guarantee wisdom. Power does not guarantee stability. Empires, businesses, leaders, and even individuals can appear strong on the outside, while something inside is already beginning to collapse. Belshazzar believed the palace banquet proved Babylon's greatness. But at the same moment the king was celebrating, the river outside the city was quietly dropping, and an army was already entering the gates. The danger had arrived long before the king noticed it. That is often how history works. The fall of great powers rarely begins with a sudden event. It begins with small decisions. Pride, ignoring warnings, mocking what should be respected, believing success will last forever. Then one day, the writing appears on the wall, and suddenly everyone realizes the end was already approaching. But there is also another message hidden within this story. While kings and empires rose and fell, one man remained faithful, Daniel. He had lived through multiple rulers, multiple political changes, multiple moments of crisis. Yet his faith remained steady. He did not seek power. He did not chase rewards. When Belshazzar offered wealth and position, Daniel calmly said the king could keep them. Because Daniel understood something the king did not. Earthly power fades, but truth remains. That is why Daniel could stand calmly in the middle of a terrified palace. While everyone else panicked, he spoke with clarity. He knew the message on the wall was not chaos. It was justice, and justice does not arrive randomly. It arrives when the time has been counted. The story of Babylon may feel ancient. Stone walls, royal banquets, kings wearing gold crowns. But the message written on that palace wall was never meant for only one king. It was meant for every generation. Because the truth behind the words MENE, TEKEL, PARSIN is something every person eventually faces. Time, accountability, and the question of what truly matters. King Belshazzar believed he had endless time. His palace was strong. His kingdom was rich. His city was famous across the world. From the outside, everything looked secure. But the message on the wall revealed something terrifying. His time had already been counted. MENE. God had numbered the days of his reign, and those days had reached their end. The king did not know it. The guests at the banquet did not know it. But heaven already knew. And this truth still speaks to the world today. No one truly knows how many days they have. People plan for years ahead. They build careers. They build businesses. They build reputations. But the number of their days is something only God sees. This does not mean life should be lived in fear, but it does mean life should be lived with awareness. Because Belshazzar's greatest mistake was not simply arrogance. It was forgetting that life itself is a gift. Daniel said something unforgettable that night. You did not honor the God who holds your life in his hand. Those words cut through centuries of history. Everything people depend on can disappear. Money can vanish. Power can fade. Fame can be forgotten. But the one thing no person controls is the breath in their lungs. Every moment of life exists because God allows it. Then came the second word, TEKEL. You have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. In ancient markets, merchants carefully weighed silver and gold to make sure it was pure. If the metal was not heavy enough, if it contained impurities, it failed the test. Belshazzar had been placed on the scale of truth, and the result was devastating. He had failed, but the message was never meant only for kings. Every life is weighed in some way, not by popularity, not by wealth, not by social status, but by something deeper: character, integrity, humility, the choices people make when no one is watching. Belshazzar's feast looked powerful, but behind the celebration was something empty: disrespect for what was sacred, mockery of truth, pride without gratitude. The king believed his greatness protected him, but when the scale revealed his true weight, the illusion disappeared. And then came the final word, PARSIN. The kingdom would be divided. Everything Belshazzar believed belonged to him would pass into someone else's hands. That may be the most powerful lesson of all. Every empire eventually changes rulers. Every fortune eventually changes owners. Every generation eventually passes its world to the next one. People often spend their entire lives chasing things they cannot keep: power, recognition, possessions. But the fall of Babylon reminds us how quickly those things can vanish. One night, one moment, one message on a wall, and everything changes. Yet in the middle of this dramatic story, there is also a quiet example of something different. Daniel. He had lived through multiple kings. He had watched kingdoms rise and fall. But his life was not built on the power of Babylon. It was built on faith. That is why he was not afraid when the mysterious writing appeared. While the king trembled, Daniel stood calmly. While the nobles panicked, Daniel spoke truth. His confidence did not come from politics or power. It came from knowing that history itself is guided by something greater than kings. The story of Babylon reveals a powerful contrast. On one side was Belshazzar, a king surrounded by wealth and celebration, yet terrified when the truth appeared. On the other side was Daniel, a servant without political power, yet calm in the face of judgment. The difference between them was not intelligence. It was perspective. Belshazzar believed the palace was the center of the world. Daniel understood that God was. And that difference changed everything. Because when people build their lives on temporary things, they panic when those things disappear. But when people build their lives on something eternal, they remain steady even when the world shakes. The message on the wall did not just announce the fall of Babylon. It revealed something deeper. History is not random. Power is not permanent. And pride is never as strong as it appears. Eventually, every person must face the same question that echoed through that ancient palace. When life is weighed, what will the scale reveal? The palace of Babylon eventually grew quiet. The feast ended. The torches burned low. And the empire that once ruled the ancient world disappeared into history. But the writing on that wall did not disappear. Its message has continued echoing through generations for thousands of years. Because the fall of Babylon was never just about one city. It was about a truth that every generation must face. Power does not last forever. King Belshazzar believed his kingdom was secure. His city had enormous walls. His palace was filled with gold. His banquet hall was filled with the most powerful people in the empire. Everything around him looked strong. But strength on the outside does not always mean stability on the inside. At the exact moment the king felt most confident, his kingdom was already slipping away. While the celebration filled the palace, the river outside the city was quietly lowering, and an army was already entering through the gates. History often moves like that. The most dramatic collapses rarely begin with loud warnings. They begin quietly. Small decisions, ignored lessons, growing pride, until suddenly the message appears, and people realize the end had already begun. That is why the mysterious words written that night remain so powerful. MENE. Life is not endless. Time is being counted. Every day that passes is one step closer to the moment when every life is complete. TEKEL. Every life is weighed, not by titles, not by wealth, not by applause from crowds, but by something deeper: truth, character, faith, the things that remain when everything else fades. PARSIN. Everything on earth eventually passes to someone else. Empires change rulers. Wealth changes owners. Generations change the world again and again. But something greater continues through all of it. The God who writes history. The God who sees every decision. The God who knows every heart. And that is why the story of Babylon ends with a powerful contrast. One king trembled in fear when the truth appeared. One servant stood calmly because he already knew it. Daniel did not fear the message on the wall, because his life was not built on Babylon's power. It was built on faith. While kings rose and fell around him, Daniel remained steady, because the foundation of his life could not collapse. That is the deeper message behind the ancient story. Everyone eventually faces a moment when the truth becomes clear. A moment when success, power, and distractions no longer hide what truly matters. And in that moment, the question becomes simple. What has your life been built on? The palace of Babylon is gone. Its kings are long forgotten. But the message written on that wall still stands. And perhaps the most important part of the story is this. The writing on the wall was not meant to terrify people. It was meant to wake them up, to remind every generation that pride is fragile, power is temporary, and time is precious. Because unlike Belshazzar, we still have the chance to choose what truly matters. And that decision is being written every day, long before any message appears on the wall.